so my concept of drug use and addiction, bad people use drugs.
Christina Dent grew up Christian and conservative. When she became a foster parent in 2014, her eyes were opened to the reality of addiction and our systems of care.
And here comes this woman running across the parking lot towards me, and she's weeping. And she runs over and just starts kissing this little baby while I'm holding his car seat. And this is his mom, Joanne. She gave herself to her son, and she let me witness that holy ground. Bad people use drugs.
This would forever change the way Christina saw people with substance use disorder and set wheels in motion that would bring Christina to the very edge of substance use advocacy with her organization, End It for Good.
I realized I have misunderstood a lot, and I know we're putting people like Joanne in prison every day for the exact same thing that she was struggling with. I could immediately see the cascade effect that would have in her life and Beckham's life. It's not going to help her deal with her addiction. Drugs are readily available in jails and prisons.
In this episode, I talked to Christina about her personal journey into substance use advocacy, how she believes our current systems of care are only making the problems worse, and what we can do to improve health outcomes for people who use substances in the grips of this current toxic drug crisis.
The things we're doing to solve the problem are, for the vast majority of those solutions, they're actually making the problem worse.
But before we get into it, what's up? My name's Dan, podcaster, keynote speaker, and advocate, and this is Hard Knocks Talks, your addictions podcast. If you have a question or comment, leave it in the comment section below or reach out to me at daniel@hardknockstalks.com. Every voice in this conversation matters, and we want to hear yours. Now, let's get into it.
This is Hard Knocks Talks.
Christina, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Hey, everyone.
Thank you so much for joining us today. You are doing some pretty incredible work, and basically, you had me at Christian Conservative Harm Reduction Advocate. So that was like, yeah, you got to come on.
Yeah.
So,
yep.
yeah.
Different journey to where I am now.
Yeah, well, and you haven't always been so in the know about harm reduction and about drug policy and about things like that. And in fact, you admit, even on your website, I read your bio briefly, and in the first little bit, it talks about how your opinions changed. I mean, you grew up Catholic, conservative, and you thought you had a grip on what the world looked like until you became a foster parent in 2014. So why don't we start there? Why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience coming into being a foster parent and the things that you saw that really started to influence your views on the world?
Yeah. So I grew up in Mississippi, in the U.S., and I was part of a wonderful family. I had a happy childhood. Not that I didn't have sad things happen in my childhood, but it was in a very supportive environment, very loving family. And so my concept of drug use and addiction followed a lot what I heard from the culture around me, which is, bad people use drugs. And if you're struggling with an addiction, that's kind of like you're really bad. And even though I grew up in this wonderful family and church community, my family were committed Christians. I still am today. Grew up in a very conservative community, very family oriented, very a lot of encouragement to make good choices. And I kind of put together, hey, if you make the good choices, then things kind of work out for you and the adults are proud of you and life works best. Mm-hmm. And so I was good at kind of making the quote unquote good choices. And I liked the praise that came from that. And so I got through my teenage life without ever using drugs. I had no interest in drug use. Even alcohol use was never drinking with my friends. I went to a Christian college. I got a degree in Bible. Didn't use drugs there either. And so all of my childhood, all of my early adulthood, into my early 30s, I really was never challenged in the way that I thought about drugs or addiction. It never really came close to me. And so in 2014, my husband and I became foster parents. I was in my early 30s then. And all so I come into this world where most children who are removed into foster care are removed because of some sort of parental drug use problem. But I have no knowledge of what is actually going on. And it's not part of the training that I go to or anything like that. And so I'm kind of thrust into this world where I think I know what's happening because I've grown up in a culture that's told me what's happening with drugs. But the second child that we fostered, his mom had been struggling with addictions for about 20 years by the time that I met her. This was her first child. And at the time, it was a methamphetamine addiction. I didn't even know what methamphetamine was at the time. I had no concept of what the different drugs were. I didn't even know that some were stimulants and some were depressants. I mean, I just had no idea anything about this. And so her baby was born and he was removed from her custody because of her prenatal drug use. She was not able to beat her addiction, even though she was so excited to be pregnant with this child that doctors had told her she would never be able to conceive. And so he's born, he's removed into foster care, and he's brought to our house straight from the hospital. And so he comes, he's this tiny little preemie, 5-pound, 9-ounce, adorable baby. And I think in my mind, that I know what's happening. I'm a mom. I wouldn't ever do this. I could never imagine myself using drugs while I was pregnant. And so the only way I have to...
That's what I was going to jump into there. Unpack your thoughts around that. Now, when you first got into foster parenting, when you first decided to get into foster parenting, was it a thought of, I'm going to save these babies from these horrible people? Or what was your reason?
Very torn. So I think probably a lot of foster parents feel this way, but so there's this sense of, I want to be part of bringing healing in a child's life. There's a part of you that knows, for some children, that means going back with their birth family. And yet it's really hard to be supportive of that because generally speaking, people's children don't end up in foster care unless something at least visually is wrong with their home. And I say that just because I have learned after being in foster care that there are absolutely children who are removed from their parents' custody who are not being harmed in that home. And so I think that was shocking to me. I thought there's no way a child could ever be taken away from their parents unless there's just egregious abuse and neglect. And that's just not the case. It's pretty easy for a child to be taken away. And sometimes that does happen when they shouldn't be removed from their parents' custody. For a long time in Mississippi, until just a couple of years ago, you could be removed solely based on a positive drug test from a parent. No evidence of abuse or neglect, solely based on a positive drug test, including marijuana. So you've got wait a second, we know there's all kinds of people out there who are using substances they might use it at a party on a weekend or something like that. They're not endangering their children. It might not be wise. This is not a commentary on how wise substance use is. It's just to say that we should be, being removed into foster care is incredibly traumatic for a child and a family. We should be very careful about when we subject children to being ripped out of their homes and put in strangers' homes and being kept from their parents. That's a really big deal.
Yeah.
So I came in with this kind of, I want to be part of healing in children's lives. We were open to adoption, but we felt like, if there's a child who needs to be adopted, we could be that adoptive family. If they're going back with their birth family, then, we'll be as supportive of that as we can. And yet recognizing that's really hard when you're on the foster parent side, the natural draw is towards, I think this child would be safer with me. Because we all think we're great people. So, that's definitely, was definitely a rub. But I knew immediately with this baby, with Beckham, that his mom, Joanne, was very much wanting to regain custody of him. The social worker told us that from the beginning. She's very motivated. She really wants to be with her child, which didn't make sense to me because I'm thinking, well, if she really wanted to be with her child, why was she using drugs while she was pregnant? This doesn't go together. So he was brought to our house, and a couple of days later, I took him to his first visit with his mom at our local child welfare office, and pulled into the parking lot, and my other kids are unstrapping from their seat belts, and I pop Beckham's little car seat out and turn around in the parking lot to walk in. And here comes this woman running across the parking lot towards me, and she's weeping, and she runs over and just starts kissing this little baby while I'm holding his car seat. And this is his mom, Joanne. And I don't have any idea how to process what's even happening. This is not what I was expecting at all. I immediately go to suspicion of, wait a second, this can't be real. This is a show of some kind. And so we walk into the child welfare office. She gets 1 hour to spend with him. I take my kids to a nearby park, come back again to pick Beckham up. And I walk into the room, the visitation room. It's really tiny. It's only big enough for one couch to be along one wall. Like it's like a couch by a couch, basically, size of room. And she's sitting on this couch, and Beckham is up on her shoulder sleeping. And she's just sitting there with her eyes closed. She just is drinking in her son. Now, she's not scrolling on her phone or anything like that. She's just enjoying every minute that she has with him. And that image will just be burned into my mind forever, because it was such a picture of this fierce love, this desire to be with him. And I didn't understand how that could be true. I put a significant amount of mental energies into figuring out why it couldn't be true, because that would fit the narrative that I had in my mind about addiction and people who are using. And yet, I took him back to our house that afternoon. She left for inpatient drug treatment, but she would call me from treatment and ask me to tell her everything that I could about him. What was he doing that day? How much was he eating? She wanted to know everything. And then she would ask me to put her on speakerphone, and she would sing to him over the phone. I can be standing in my kitchen listening to her singing "Jesus Loves Me" to her little boy, finding any way to connect with him because she couldn't be physically present there. And the more that I got to know her, the more I became able to really take in that she is a mom like me. She loves her son just as much as I love my 3 sons. She wants to be there for him, and she's also struggling with this addiction. And that really forced me to hold these two things simultaneously. She is a mom like me, and she's struggling with a methamphetamine addiction. And what do I do with that? Because everything I've always picked up from the broader culture around me is that those things can't be true. If she's struggling with an addiction, she's not someone like me. But now I'm seeing that. And for people who hear this story, what I want them to hear most is that Joanne is the hero of the story. It is not me. It is her. She was the one who took the risk, who was vulnerable enough to let me see who she really is, which is an amazing person, an inspiring person, a person who has fought every day for the last 8 years to maintain her sobriety and raise her son. She is the one that has fought and has done all of the work to make this possible for them. And she let me in on that at a time where she didn't have to. And oftentimes, it's that relationship can be really fraught for a birth parent. The state has decided some random lady is going to be a better mom to your son than you are. Like, that's a really difficult position to be in for a mother. And so, but she didn't hold me at arm's length. She didn't treat me as though I was, overstepping her territory. She gave herself to her son, and she let me witness that holy ground in a way that was just life-changing for me. And it set me on this journey of learning that I realized I have misunderstood a lot. And I know we're putting people like Joanne in prison every day for the exact same thing that she was struggling with. Now, I could immediately see the cascade effect that would have in her life and Beckham's life. It's not going to help her deal with her addiction. Drugs are readily available in jails and prisons. It's going to leave Beckham without a mom who clearly loves him and wants to be there for him. And what impact is that going to have cascading down into these next generations, as I had learned about childhood trauma and the impact that has, and the risks that it puts us at risk for in the future. It was kind of the same heart that had brought me to foster care. If I want to be part of healing what's broken in our world, drew me into this learning journey of, wait a second, there's more to this. This is deeper.
Mm-hmm.
And the more that I dug, the more I realized, oh, wow, this is impacting almost every area of our lives, whether we recognize it or not. And the things we're doing to solve the problem are, for the vast majority of those solutions, they're actually making the problem worse. And that kept me on this journey, and we can dive into that, what I learned along that way. But got passionate enough to start an organization, and this is what I do full time now, inviting people to consider, to learn what these root causes of harm are, and to consider how we can reduce harm and help more people stay alive, help protect public safety, help families to stay together, things that are values across whatever political spectrum you're on. All of us are better served when we address drugs and addiction in a more helpful way.
Yeah. So tell me what it was like for you when you started to come to these realizations, and certainly you started to immerse yourself in educating yourself about what's actually going on, and I'm assuming your language around the topic kind of changed a little bit. And what was it in your circle, like in your social circles, within your family, when you started coming into these circles and talking about these things? Certainly the people around you were just as uninformed as you were walking into it. Did you receive any pushback from your loved ones or from your friends?
I can remember the first time that I heard someone use the term junkie, after I'd kind of been on this learning journey. So it's kind of, I think a lot of things in life are like this. We don't really realize just what's kind of shifting inside of us until we read something and we realize, I think, or we hear something, and previously it wouldn't have bothered us, and all of a sudden it does bother us, and we say, wait, what happened? Because I know I've heard that word before, and I don't think it's ever hit me that way before. And I can remember I was at a social gathering, and somebody was asking me about foster care. And this was not related to Beckham. He wasn't with us at the time, but just related to parents in general of the children that we were fostering. And they made just a comment about, oh, yeah, it's like their mom's a junkie. And it just kind of just shook me, because I had been doing all of this learning about what really drives addiction, and it had just broken my heart. Here I had grown up thinking people struggle with addiction because they're bad, because they're making bad choices, because they don't want to do what's right. And I had been learning about, no, what's really going on is this deep pain that people are in, lots of different kinds of pain they could be struggling with. But substance use is a way to at least for a little while escape that pain, and to try to self-medicate that pain. And so what I had previously seen through this judgmental lens, I was now seeing through this empathetic lens of, I understand what that's like to be in pain. I don't understand what it's like to use drugs to medicate that pain, but I definitely understand what it's like to do lots of other things in life to try to feel better, to try to cope with grief, to try to cope with loss, to try to cope with, lots of different things. And so, I remember that. So I realized, okay, I'm shifting here. I'm learning things that are changing who I am, the way that I think about the world, and the way that I think about these issues and people who are struggling with addiction. And then I started talking about what I had actually learned publicly. And that was terrifying because it was, as I learned, I basically rethought everything that I used to think about the right way to approach drugs and addiction. And by right, I mean, what's effective? What is actually going to be effective at reducing harm from drugs and addiction? And so on that learning journey, I learned about consumers like Joanne, that incarcerating them is compounding the problem for the vast majority of people who experience that. It makes life much harder for them, doesn't keep them from drugs, but it adds a lot of trauma to their life and to their family. And that actually is increasing their likelihood of struggling with addiction or for their addiction to deepen. And so I had reversed my thinking on that to, we need to approach this in a health-centered way, not through the criminal justice system for people who are using drugs. But also that learning had spilled over into learning about drug markets, and that when you force a market for a popular substance out of the legal market, it doesn't go away, it just moves underground. And it creates a lot of different kinds of harm. One of those is it creates a lot of crime, because now the only people who can produce and sell drugs that are illegal are people who are breaking the law. And so you end up funding the $650 billion a year. That's the global market for illegal drugs. $650 billion a year is going to only people who are willing to break the law to get some of that money. There's a never-ending supply of people who are willing to break the law to get some of that money. It's an awful lot of money on the table. And so the creation of crime and violence by forcing these markets underground was really surprising to me. It was not something I'd ever thought about. It's sort of economics 101. It's not whether or not you want that to happen. It just is what we know happens with underground markets, that if consumers want something and they're willing to pay for it, there will always be people willing to supply it. Whether you allow that to happen legally or not, you can change that through the law, but the supply will be there one way or the other. And so it creates a lot of crime, and also creates this contamination crisis that we're dealing with right now, where it's not, the substances being sold aren't regulated. So there's no quality control. People can put whatever they want to in it. They sell it in a baggie or in pressed pills. Consumers don't have any idea what the potency is that they're getting. And many of them are dying not from the drug itself per se. That's true even of fentanyl is used in medical settings every day. In every hospital. And yet when you take it out of a regulated setting like that, people don't have any idea how potent it is, and they're dying from the inability to dose it properly.
Yeah.
So that ended up changing my minds about those on the market side too. And that was the really terrifying part to talk about, because I don't want people using drugs, and I think they can be incredibly destructive in people's lives. And yet criminalizing them and banning them has made them far more destructive to the people who are using them and to the rest of society, as we live with the fallout of the overdose crisis, crime being as high as it is. And so much of that is caused by the prohibition of drugs.
So where do you stand on that then? Because my stance is ever evolving on the thought of legalization, of regulation, and things like that. And my listeners have heard me say this countless times before. I don't think that the regulation of alcohol should be the benchmark for all of these illicit substances. I'm driving my kids to school every day, and I don't typically listen to the radio, but for the past couple of days, I've been listening to the radio. And I got to say, the advertisements that I'm hearing for alcohol and for spirits and for, different types of cider, and they're making it sound so good. And this is how you celebrate summer, and this is how you do this, and this is how you, and it's just conditioning. And for adults like me, I can differentiate. I've had my life experiences. I know what works for me, but my 5-year-old and my 10-year-old is sitting in the back seat listening to this same thing. Now, I hope that my 5-year-old and 10-year-old have been sitting at the dinner table and in our lives, and they hear Donna and I go and have conversations about drug policy and about what we think is right and what we think is wrong. And hopefully that has an influence. But do you think that should be the case for all now illicit substances? Like, should I turn on my radio and hear like Weiser's meth is now available? Come celebrate spring on the patio with a nice shot of meth. Like, what do you think about all of that? I'm interested.
Yeah. So no, I hope not.
Me too. I sincerely hope not.
Yes. So I am always looking for the best middle ground. I think anytime we swing a pendulum really far in one direction or the other direction, we end up getting extra harm. So the solution to incarcerating as many people as possible for drug possession is not to just stop incarcerating anyone no matter what they're doing. And that absolutely can be the pendulum swing where people
Mm-hmm.
say, hey, we've been arresting people who are struggling with addiction. And now, really, no matter what behavior they're engaging in, whether it's public drug use, whether it's theft, whatever, we just have to have compassion for that because of their addiction. And we can't really enforce that. And we
Mm-hmm.
would say, no, there's a clear line between drug possession and infringing on other people's
Safety.
rights and safety and property and all of those other things. And it's important to for a civil society to be able to have those rules enforced. So
Mm-hmm.
even if we know, see, this is where I would say drug courts would come in particularly handy. I don't think people should be arrested for drug possession, but there are lots of other crimes that people might commit as a result of their addiction. Most property crimes are committed by people who are trying to get enough money to fund their addiction.
Mm-hmm.
So you might have a property crime that the criminal justice system is the right tool to respond to that. But maybe that's the opportunity for a drug court to come in and say, hey, we recognize that we do have to be involved here because you have infringed on someone else's property and possessions. But we also recognize that addiction really is the root cause of that. And so we're going to give you an opportunity to address the addiction
Mm-hmm.
and be held accountable for the crime. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that's one type of pendulum swing I think we really need to guard against. It's not just saying everybody go do whatever they want to. And I
Yeah.
think the same is true on the market side, where we can say, criminalizing a market, we tend to think of prohibition, I think, as the ultimate form of regulation. And really, it's the absence of any form of regulation.
Hmm.
Anybody can produce the drugs, anybody can sell the drugs, anybody can buy the drugs. There are no age gates. There are no, you can buy whatever you want at 13, just like you can at 43. There's no quality control. There's no ingredients. There's no licensing of whoever is selling these things. So to me, that is one side of really, really not good. The pendulum swing too far would be, let's just go make all these things legal, celebrate them, advertise them everywhere, make
Yeah.
them totally socially normal. And I think that's
And
the other side we
encouraged.
don't want to swing to. Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
don't want to swing to that.
Commercialization.
Yes. And I think it's hard because we've seen with other things like tobacco here in the US where we have allowed people to use. And then we've also seen the really harmful side of that. And we've had huge tobacco settlements. And now where we are, I think, is a helpful place in that we have significantly reduced the number of people who are smoking.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't done it through criminalization. We don't arrest people. We didn't go that route.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, we said, okay, there's all kinds of regulations around advertising, around the age to smoke, around the social norms that have
Mm-hmm.
changed significantly around smoking, and lots of incentives not to smoke. Like you get better insurance rates if you're not smoking. So
Mm-hmm.
to me, those are really positive ways of saying we don't want to ban cigarettes because that would just create this underground market for them and it would create a whole lot of harm.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
we also want to address them in a way where it is not socially celebrated anymore to be out smoking.
Yeah.
And that, that's no shade on people who are still choosing to smoke, but just to say we know it's really bad for your health, and so we're gonna handle that in a way that people are very aware of that
Yeah.
growing up now,
Yeah.
instead
Yeah.
of not being aware and only seeing this sort of celebratory
Yeah.
side.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe this is an aside to this, but something popped into my mind. I was talking to a woman yesterday. Shout out Anna. I know you're going to watch this at some point, so this one's for you. She was telling me that they've learned that reducing the hours of sale, because in Saskatchewan you can get alcohol from 8 a.m. in the morning till 3 a.m. in the morning, and I don't know if it's different in the States or whatever, but they reduced those in certain communities to whatever. I don't know what they reduced them to, but they saw a marked difference in the level of substance and alcohol related harms that were coming to that community. So another interesting fact she shared with me was The government of Saskatchewan spends 70 cents on on every single drink, every single alcoholic drink. 70 cents goes towards mitigating the harms that come from alcohol use in Saskatchewan. 70 cents. You have a drink, you have a beer on your patio, 70 cents of that is going to mitigate harms in Saskatchewan from the harms, So that was quite an eye-opening statistic that I heard yesterday. Barb, sorry, one sec. We got Barb here in the chat, and Barb says regulation should mean radio ads aren't happening for any substances. She goes on to say, I think current tobacco regulation is a better example than alcohol regulation if we were seeking a model to learn from.
Yeah, I was actually just reading about an initiative. I think this was happening in Arizona, where they were working to change. So Arizona has legal cannabis, and there were a lot of people who were unhappy with advertising related to it. Apparently, there's a billboard with a Santa smoking a joint every Christmas, that went up, and people were unhappy with that. Understandably so. I wouldn't want my kids seeing that either. And so they actually went and they found that the cannabis dispensaries, the owners of the dispensaries, were actually open to some good regulations around advertising. They saw it as that they wanted the community to also be to not perceive that they were hurting the community. And so you might have the one outlier who wants to go do the Santa cannabis, billboard every year. But a lot of the dispensaries didn't want that. To them, they see that as a negative for what they're trying to do. They don't want to be seen as people who are out there doing things that the community and parents feel is harmful. And so I think that's to me, that was a really great. So they were coming to the table saying, hey, let's come together and create some good regulations around advertising. Now, whether or not everyone's going to be happy with those, that's up for debate. But so that would be definitely where we would fall kind of in that middle ground of, yes, legal markets help to reduce some of the harms of criminalized markets. And there are also downsides to that. So every policy is a pro and con weighing. And I think often we think we're only looking for sort of perfect solution policies. Those just don't exist. So we're always weighing pros and cons. What I think has happened with how we handle drugs is that we haven't recognized just how many cons we're currently living with, because it's the only world that we've ever lived in. We don't remember the world. It was 100 years ago. We don't remember the world where these drugs, including drugs like heroin and cocaine, were sold legally in legal markets. You could be prescribed heroin by your doctor. It was available in very low dose forms over the counter in different soothing syrups and things like that.
Cocaine was in Coca-Cola. That's where they got the name from.
Cocaine was in Coca-Cola. Yes. And also in, children's all these different little tinctures for kids. There were different things that were help with teething and, all these different things.
Give them the old
heroin.
Even
fathom that. We can't fathom that world. And so I was talking with a guy who's done a lot of research, and he wrote a book on addiction, and he's been doing a lot of research related to this, the last kind of 100 years of how we've handled drugs. And so we did have some harm that happened from that. But instead of addressing that, instead of saying, hey, how can we keep children safe from this 100 years ago when they were seeing this, instead it was, this kind of switch to, no, let's just criminalize it. Let's ban it. And they were able to get the political will for that by connecting it to minority communities. At the time, 100 years ago, it was Chinese immigrants. Later, it was African American people. And so there is, we don't remember the world that was before Prohibition entered the scene. When I got into this, I thought it had always been that way. I just thought drugs like heroin and cocaine had always been illegal. Like it was kind of their default mechanism. And yet that is a really, really new approach to drugs in the history of the world. We've had thousands of years of documented history of substance use by humans. And only in about the last 100 have we tried to actually just prohibit drugs off of the face of the earth. And it hasn't worked. We still, you can ask anybody who's trying to get heroin. There's nobody out there who's trying to get heroin that says, my gosh, I just can't. I just can't get it. Anything that people want is available for them if they go looking for it.
Yeah.
And so we want to try to find that middle ground where we can reduce the harm from illegal markets by bringing them back legal, so we can get some regulatory control, so we can reduce crime, and also be careful that we don't swing that pendulum too far, and we get the lots of harms that can happen with legal markets also. But one point on that, because I think people, especially here in the US, they think, no, that just gives us pill mills, that gives us doctors prescribing all kinds of opioids to people.
And that
and
did
there
happen.
were problems with that. There were problems with that. And yet the response to that has been to shut people off from legal access. And now we have in the US, illegal drug use has doubled in the last 20 years. So we might be celebrating that, look how many fewer opioid prescriptions are written. But look how many more people have just migrated over to the underground market. They're using far more harmful substances. They're engaging in a harmful market. And it's creating lots and lots of more people dying, which I think we've lost sight of the whole point of why we wanted to prohibit the drugs in the first place, which wasn't it to reduce harm to people because we were afraid that they might die? And yet the approach today has caused the most overdoses that we've ever had in our history. Yeah. So I think we've forgotten sort of the ultimate goal, and I think we have misunderstood what's actually causing so much of the harm that we have.
We still have, there's a city in Saskatchewan called Moose Jaw, and you can go and tour the tunnels of Moose Jaw. Al Capone came up here and dug a bunch of tunnels, and it was for the Prohibition era to smuggle alcohol around. So that's still a thing. Like there's still remnants of that era. So it's
yep. Same thing's happening today with all the other drugs that we have pushed underground. It's the same literally, kind of underground market. Yep. Exact same market forces, and we see the same thing happening.
Let's take a quick break here. Let me shout out today's sponsors, and we'll get back at it.
The Advancing Interprofessional Management of Substance Use Disorders in Saskatchewan program, or AIMS-SK, is offered through the College of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan and is designed to deepen healthcare professionals' understanding of substance use to improve health outcomes for individuals with substance use disorders. This program consists of 3 modules, including the foundations of harm reduction in substance use disorder, opioid use disorder, and alcohol use disorder. If you are a healthcare professional in Saskatchewan and wish to reduce stigma and better serve those with substance use disorder, look for the AIMS-SK link in the description below.
Pine Lodge, the treatment center I went to treatment 7 years ago when I got sober, offers inpatient addictions treatment and aftercare programming in Regina, Saskatchewan. To inquire about services or make a donation, call 306-510-1891. Are you affected by someone else's substance use? Family and friends can be okay and do recover. Naranon can help. Contact Ronnie at 306-731-7573 for meeting information. To make contact or learn more about today's sponsors, to check out our new merch, or if you want to show us some love and buy us a coffee, all of those links are in the show notes below. It's easy to talk about problems, and in fact, being involved in advocacy here in my hometown, there is an abundance of people who are very skilled at talking about how bad it is. So what do you see as solutions to things like our current drug laws?
Yeah, so I think there's solutions that come depending on where you are in it. So there might be solutions for families that they can implement with a loved one who's struggling with addiction. There's solutions that advocates can work on, whether that's local or national, kind of depending on what your flavor is, what you want to be involved in. One of the things that I talk about in my book, Curious, which got some free copies for your listeners if they email curious@enditforgood.com. enditforgood.com. That's curious at enditforgood.com. We've got 10 copies free. They can just let us know where you heard about it. You can get the book on Amazon too, but we'd love to give out some free copies to your listeners. So
excellent.
But one of the things I talk about in there, and I think this is a concept that it can be implemented by family members and it can be implemented on a broader scale, is thinking about recovery as stair steps rather than quantum leaps. So we've had decades of kind of recovery messaging that the only way to recover is by taking this quantum leap, going from active addiction to overnight sobriety and building a thriving life after you have stopped using. And I think what we have seen, particularly with how dangerous it is to relapse today because of the high potency of the substances that people are often relapsing with, is that when they take the quantum leap and they relapse, often that is leading to death now, instead of just back to the first step where you make another attempt at the leap to sobriety. And so I wonder if we could begin to think of the pathway to recovery as, what is, number one, how can we help people stay alive? They can't recover if they are not alive. And so how can we first just take that first step to help them stay alive today? Then what's the next step that they might be willing to take and that might not be incredibly dangerous for them to take? There are absolutely dangerous pathways that people can take that increase their risk of death. And so what's that next step? Can we open the door for more people to access maybe medications for recovery? That might not be what they want to do long term, but they've been shown to increase people's long-term sobriety and decrease their risk of death. So maybe something like buprenorphine or methadone, something like that. Well, maybe there's a step to get a part-time job. Maybe a step to find some stable housing, maybe a step to use fentanyl testing strips if they're still using drugs. There's lots of little steps along the way. And oftentimes, I think we only value when someone has gotten all the way to the end. You know, they've got the thriving life and they're sober. And that's when we celebrate. And in reality, changing any kind of behavior is incredibly difficult. I mean, you know, a small behavior for humans is really difficult to change, much less changing everything about, you know, changing who you're hanging out with, what you're doing with your time, how you're spending your money, all of these different things that have to come with moving from addiction into recovery. And so that stair-step approach, I think, could be really helpful with helping more people stay alive long enough to find and build that pathway to recovery. So I'd love to see that happen kind of all across the board, as just an openness to stair steps and lots of different pathways to recovery.
You reminded me of a story, and I told you the story before the show today, but I'm going to tell it again. Last week's guest, his episode is dropping on Monday. His name's Trevor Ledoux. He, part of his recovery journey, he was using meth. He was using alcohol very problematically, and he was mandated to see an addictions counselor, forced, some would say, depending on your lens on the whole thing. He was forced to see an addictions counselor. The addictions counselor says, okay, you haven't been drinking, you haven't been smoking meth for a little bit here. We want to make sure it stays that way. Have you considered smoking marijuana until you find some stability in not drinking and in not smoking meth? And that's what he ended up doing. And the addictions counselor, who is government funded, supported him in that. And today he's 5 years abstinent. So he did find his way. But it's interesting to me, and we were also talking before the show about the polarization of the public conversation around substance use and the divide that this conversation seems to be putting in between the abstinence-based modalities and the harm reduction modalities. When in fact, behind the scenes, there already is a very substantial gray area where these addictions workers are engaging in those practices. So as far as a solution goes, I think that was a very solid one for my friend Trevor. Would you agree?
Yeah. So then there's this part of me that's like, ooh, but you know, I don't want somebody smoking cannabis for their recovery. And yet think about what that protected him from.
Yeah.
It allowed him to stop using more harmful substances. And so that's a huge win.
Yeah.
And I think that's we're fighting mostly against our own internal, what we've kind of been taught, what we've been sort of conditioned to think is okay. And instead, I was talking to a dad who lost his son to a heroin and fentanyl overdose, and they got his son's phone. The police got the phone trying to figure out who had sold him the drugs. And what they found is that the night before he died, he had been Googling. So we live in Mississippi, where at the time, even medical cannabis was illegal. There was no legal cannabis here. He had been Googling Colorado and had been talking to his dad about, because he said, I think if I could just smoke cannabis, I could stop using the heroin. And the night before he died, he had been looking for places to live in Colorado. And that dad said, what seems like the best thing to us, when we don't realize the price we might have to pay, we can kind of hold the high horse on that. This is what we want. This is like best case scenario.
Yeah.
And
we
now
won't settle for
I've had
anything
to,
less.
I've had to, right. And now he said, if people had to really, really realize, really sit with the fact that their loved one might die, they would be open to a lot more options than they are right now.
Yeah.
He said, I would go every single day and buy my son cannabis for the rest of his life if I could just have him back. Even though this dad is a former police officer who arrested all kinds of people for cannabis, doesn't want people using cannabis, doesn't support cannabis, doesn't like it. But for him now to be able to see, we were trying to hold the high bar of what was perfect in our minds, and lost his son as a result of that. And so, he also said, which I thought, this is in the book also, the broader part of their story is in the book, Curious. He's one of the people that I interviewed for the book. He said, I don't think people realize that all of our greatest fears about what would happen if more drugs were legal, they're all realized already today. It's what prohibition has given us. We're worried about death. We're worried about addiction. We're worried about families being hurt. That's the world that we live in today, where we have addiction is total chaos for families. People are cycling in and out of the justice system. It's making life even harder. It's increasing the trauma that the family experiences and the person experiences. We've got this world of incredible harm around drugs and addiction. And we just have been unable to see what was actually causing that harm. So he says our greatest fears are actually what we're living with today. But we do have an opportunity to shift how we're approaching things to potentially reduce some of those harms. Legal access has lots of problems. Prohibition has even more problems. So I think that's how I think about it, is that weighing of pros and cons. I think there's just a whole lot more cons on the side of prohibition than I certainly understood previously. And I think for me, it is just the inviting people to consider those root causes, because even if we disagree on solutions, the solutions have to deal with the root causes of the problem, or they're not going to be solutions. They're just reactions. They're just doing something, but not actually solving things. And so I want to see more families like Joanne is today, the mother of our foster son. She's sober and helping other people get sober. She works in a drug court. She's opening a sober living home for a mother with children. Just incredible person, incredible woman. And we get to see that because, number one, she's alive. And number two, she wasn't spending the next 10 years in prison while her son was growing up without her. That's her story is not a guaranteed outcome, but it could only happen the way that it has because she was able to access help when she was ready for it. Her son was protected with us while she was getting that help. And she would say that was a good thing. She wasn't able to parent him well until she got that help. And so that was a good kind of consequence for her. And yet spending the next decade in prison would have just been completely devastating for their family.
Clean and Sober Nation, thanks for checking us out today. It's been a minute. Clean and Sober Nation says there are no easy answers to reducing harms. And I Have to agree. Um,
Amen.
Christina, you mentioned housing, and I just want to touch on that briefly as a solution. When we're talking about reducing harms, and you were listing off different things, and one of them was housing. Now, in your opinion, when we're talking about finding safer ways for people to move on to a path of wellness, where does housing fall? Because there's been a big push for housing first. And some people maybe don't agree with that, and depending on the context and depending on the individual person, I might disagree with that as well. Where do you stand on where housing should be made available to someone who is struggling like this?
Yeah, the homelessness crisis is a really complex crisis. I've talked to a lot of different people about that, and kind of where the solutions lie, and kind of similar with addiction in that there are no easy solutions to it. There are no, even if you built a whole bunch of houses and gave people who were currently homeless the ability to live there,
Yeah.
that
Just
wouldn't
toss them the
magically solve
keys.
anything. Yes, it would
Yeah.
not be a magic solve. And so to me, that's a much more nuanced conversation that should happen with the people who are closest to the problem of actually working with people who are experiencing homelessness, who
Mm-hmm.
can help say, okay, we know this person, and this is what they're ready for. This is what the next step that they're open to is in their recovery. I was listening to a researcher talking about they had done a lot of work researching housing first and had not found great outcomes for that from the research that's been available in terms of does it actually reduce homelessness significantly to take that approach,
Mm-hmm.
um, and how important it is to to not just as with all kinds of problems, not just say, we think we know what you need, let's just kind of throw a solution at you.
Yeah.
When people's problems are often much more challenging, much more complex, and can't just be solved by one particular thing. And so, um, one of the things that they were advocating for was instead of just giving money to anybody who is, grant funding or whatever, to anybody who is just doing something related to homelessness,
Mm-hmm.
let's tie funding to actually solving problems. Let's tie it to measures that are shown to actually help people get back on their feet, to get the help that they need to move forward in their lives. Let's measure that instead of just programs done, whether or not those programs actually helped anyone. Let's tie that funding to actually incentivize these programs to figure out what does actually help people, what is helping people move from experiencing homelessness towards a healthier life. That's an incredibly stressful um, way to live, and certainly people don't want to live that way. So how can we help people to move into a better place in their life in taking the steps that are important to them? And one of the best ways to do that would be for all of the resources that are being put into that problem to be tied to actually solutions that they're finding, and incentivizing solutions rather than just incentivizing action in some way. And that, I think that the draw that we feel towards, as long as we're doing something, we're making a difference.
Better than
That's
nothing.
true everywhere. We can all fall into that of thinking, hey, politicians, they're trying to do something related to addiction. They're trying to solve problems related to drugs.
Yeah.
Well, just because you're doing something doesn't mean you're doing the right thing. And you can sometimes be doing the wrong thing and actually making the problem worse. And so we need to be thinking about how do we incentivize solving problems rather than just doing something. Solutions and reactions are often very different things, and we need to be really careful that we're not just reacting and we are actually solving.
We had a politician in Saskatchewan here come on social media just the other day and say everyone who's addicted belongs in treatment. Just a statement of finality, And I would like to invite him into the studio and have a conversation with him about that, to maybe unpack what that truly means and what his intentions truly are in helping people who use substances in our community, because a statement like that can be quite dangerous when it falls on the wrong ears, and further cause a divide in what we feel needs to happen. So many conversations yet to be had.
Absolutely.
Did we hit on everything you wanted to hit on today? Is there anything that we missed? Anything that you'd like to talk about before we send you on your way?
I think the thing I would want people to do the most, if they have been listening and said, I don't know about this, I'm not sure here. Send us an email, got a copy of the book, and it's free. There's no strings attached. We're not going to, come at you and say, tell us why you disagree or anything like that. But just to be open-minded and be curious, because when we look at the history of the world, we see that every generation feels certain that the way they're approaching the world is the right way, that they have found the solutions, that they are the enlightened ones. That's true for us too. And yet we can look back at all of the different parts of history and we can see the things that people were blind to in generations before us. And it is inconceivable to our minds. How could they not see? How could they not see that these things were wrong? I think this issue of how we have approached drugs and addiction, drug markets and people who are using drugs and struggling with an addiction, I think this is going to be one of those issues that our grandkids and great grandkids look back on in 50 years and they say, how could you have thought that increasing pain in a person's life was going to solve a problem that is driven by pain? That just makes no sense. How could you have lived with this world where these policies created so much harm, verifiably so, and you just continued down that path? Why didn't you say, time out? Let's try something different, because we've done the same thing over and over and we're getting worse and worse results. I think that's what they're going to be saying. Yeah. Now, we're not all going to agree on the solutions, and that's okay. For me, I want to get the conversation going and give people some good things to think about, and some good stories to connect those two, so they can see how these big ideas are working out in real people's lives. And then invite them to stay open-minded, to keep learning and growing. I tell people, don't listen to me as soon as I've stopped learning, because this issue is way too complex for us to have sort of, now we understand it. Now we've got the bow on top and we can move on. Yeah. I want us always to stay open-minded, always to stay in a place where when we learn about new things that might help people, like psychedelic therapies or something like that might seem far out to us, that might seem like, whoa, I don't know about that. And I know you guys have talked about that, but that we're open to that. And we say, I want to continue to be open to whatever works and be committed to whatever works. It's going to work differently for different people. My guess is that legalized markets are going to work better in different ways in different states. Depending on that state's culture, they're going to have a different kind of framework that's going to work best for them. Let's stay open-minded, stay willing to learn, willing to grow, willing to try some new things and be uncomfortable. Anything new is going to be uncomfortable, and we don't like to be uncomfortable. But the only way that we move forward, that we grow as people, is to embrace that discomfort and that vulnerability of something new. And I think that's the way that we're going to find the best path forward, is if we can not shy away from that vulnerability, but embrace that uncertainty a little bit, to try some new things and to find what actually is going to help people stay alive, build thriving lives, and help more families be able to be healthy and whole.
That is a beautiful way to end this conversation. Thank you for everyone who made comments today. Clean and Sober Nation, I see that super chat. Thank you very much for your support. It's always nice to see you in the chat. Barb, everyone else who watched today, thanks so much. Christina, thank you for taking the time to join us today. And I think that's it. If you want to learn more about Christina's work, there's a link in the description. Give it a click. You can find everything that she's up to. And that's it. Thanks so much, Christina. Take care.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay, if you got something out of that, please hit that like button. Leave us a comment. Leave us your thoughts. We are always interested in fostering conversations with our community, with our followers. If you are not yet subscribed, please hit that subscribe button. Every engagement helps us. Every engagement tells the algorithms that what we are doing here does in fact matter, and people do in fact want to hear it. So that's all I've got for you today. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.
Say, this is Hard Knocks Talks.